Canadians are reasonable, and we are polite, but we will not back down from a fight. Now, it's not in my habit to agree with the Wall Street Journal, but Donald, they point out that even though you're a very smart guy, this is a very dumb thing to do.
Losses in the U.S. stock market continue Tuesday, the reaction to new tariffs imposed by the Trump administration on imports from America's three biggest trading partners. 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and an additional 10% tariffs on China, leading to retaliation on U.S. exports. Some economists and world leaders declaring a trade war is underway. White House correspondent Brett Samuels joining us to discuss this and more. Brett, the line you often heard from the free trade supporters of President Trump was that these tariff threats are a negotiating tactic. He's not going to actually implement them. Have they been proven wrong?
Yeah, it's all fun and games until tariffs actually go into effect, and then it creates the whole ripple effect of other countries imposing retaliatory tariffs. I think those sort of folks who try to frame it that way, I think they are sort of realizing that Trump actually truly believes in tariffs, not just as a negotiating tool, but as a sort of economic tool. Consequences be damned.
We heard from Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau just there. Interestingly, his party's prospects and popularity have shot up during this rift with the United States. He says the U.S. has launched a trade war against his country. Let's take a listen to Doug Ford. He's the Premier of Ontario.
If they want to try to annihilate Ontario, I will do everything, including cut off their energy, with a smile on my face.
Tough words from the friendly Canadians there. How much pain can the Canadians inflict on the U.S.?
Yeah, certainly in the short term, I think they can inflict a significant amount of pain. We heard from Senator Susan Collins of Maine when Trump was initially threatening tariffs against Canada, where she spoke about the fact that Maine, for example, really relies on Canadian imports, Canadian energy imports specifically, as we heard in that clip, to power their homes, especially in the winter. Obviously, lumber imports, various other imports that the U.S. relies on. So long term, certainly the U.S. can inflict much more damage on Canada, but in the short term, no doubt there will be some downstream effects that will hurt Americans.
The Trump tariffs on China are now 20%. This is on top of tariffs imposed during the first Trump administration, kept on and intensified in many times by President Biden. China has now responded. 15% tariffs on chicken, wheat, corn, and cotton, 10% tariffs on sorghum, soybeans, pork, beef, fruits, vegetables, dairy, and fish products. Trump seemed to acknowledge the implications for U.S. agriculture, posting a message to farmers on Truth Social saying, get ready to start making a lot of agricultural products to be sold inside of the United States. If I'm a farmer who sells soybeans to China and it's 1.4 billion people, and Trump's now telling me to sell in the United States, 340 million people, seems to me that would be a big loss.
Yeah, I think that gets at sort of this issue with Trump's worldview here with tariffs, which is that Trump sees tariffs as a way to sort of bring more production into the United States, to get companies to come to the United States, to get farmers, for example, to increase production and sell more of their product in the United States. But the world economy is just so intertwined now. It's so global. Countries selling to other countries, different markets. Farming, for example, it's not growing season year-round here in the United States. So what happens when it's not growing season here, and farmers don't have crops to sell in the United States? So it's just more complicated than that, to your point. And so I think that is where we will see, certainly again, some of these downstream consequences of this trade war.
Trump and his supporters would say, hey, look, Trump is scoring some manufacturing wins here. There was an announcement yesterday from the Taiwanese semiconductor company saying it would invest $100 billion to produce high-end chips in the United States. Honda says it's going to make its new Honda Civic hybrid in Indiana instead of Mexico. Trump says Apple is going to invest $500 billion in the U.S. Here's the president yesterday.
It's going to be great. It's looking really strong. I don't think this country has ever seen anything like we're seeing right now.
Say this is proof that his economic policies are working.
Certainly, yeah. The White House has essentially made that argument that the threat of tariffs, or the threat that if you don't do business in the United States, you'll face some kind of repercussion, and that Trump is sort of using that tough language has motivated those companies to do more business in the United States. Certainly, on the one hand, you can't argue with those results. We've seen a number of companies, sort of bowing to Trump in terms of policy and investing significant sums of money here. But again, long term, I think, we heard from the CEO of Target, for example, that it will likely, these tariffs will lead to price increases. So it is a sort of balancing act of, yes, there's more investment in the United States. Will that lower prices? Sort of remains to be seen.
I want to talk about Trump's big speech tonight to a joint session of Congress. First time he's going to be doing that in 5 years. It's a chance to get some eyeballs that might not normally be tuned into politics. How do you think he's going to sell the first month and a half of his presidency?
Yeah, certainly to your point, Drew, I think these annual addresses to Congress have become essentially a messaging exercise, an opportunity for the sitting president to get eyeballs, to draw attention to sort of pet causes. I think certainly we'll see President Trump strike a triumphant note. He's going to talk a lot about how much he's accomplished in the first 6 weeks. I would not be surprised if you see him blame a lot of sort of the issues, the underlying issues he's facing on the previous administration, sort of cleaning his hands of issues like inflation and rising prices. But the touted theme of this is the renewal of the American dream. So I think that gets at this idea that we can expect President Trump to be very triumphant and talking about how much his administration has done in such a short time.
Last time Trump spoke to one of these joint sessions of Congress, Nancy Pelosi ripped up the speech in that famous and dramatic action. Don't think we're going to see anything quite like that this time, but it is interesting that Elissa Slotkin, the Democratic senator from Michigan, is going to be delivering the Democratic response. She won in Michigan on the same ballot as Trump. There's been lots of talk about which way will the Democrats go as they try to rebuild after 2024 election losses. Slotkin is not a economic populist in the mold of Bernie Sanders or AOC. Should this be taken as the Democratic Party trying to take a tack to the center?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment of it. I think it's interesting. You always see sort of who the opposition party chooses to respond to these speeches. It is always kind of a good barometer, I think, of where the party stands at a given moment. 1 year it was Stacey Abrams, reflective of where the party thought it was going. Now it's Elissa Slotkin, who, as you mentioned, sort of moderate Democrat from a blue wall state that the Democrats lost, but she managed to win down ballot, former national security background. Obviously, so I do think this is reflective of Democrats thinking that they want to elevate someone like this and show the broader public that this is someone who could be the face of their party.
Lastly, I want to talk about Linda McMahon. She has been confirmed as the education secretary. It was a party line vote. She is a former professional wrestling CEO, doesn't have a lot of experience in education. Of course, Trump says he wants to dismantle the agency. There's a new poll from NPR that says 63% of Americans oppose that idea, but in an email to employees, McMahon said that she wanted to transfer control of education oversight back to states. How's that going to look under her leadership?
Yeah, Trump talked about nominating Linda McMahon and then wanting her to put herself out of a job. So it's sort of this weird dynamic for her where certainly the education department has, billions of dollars in funding. It oversees student loan aid and all that kind of thing. But as you said, she is now saying she wants to transfer some of the power to the states. So, whether that means just forking over the funding to states and letting them disperse it as they see fit. At the same time, you have Trump talking about, cutting off federal funding for schools that have COVID vaccine mandates. So it is a sort of almost contradictory messaging that we're getting on the education department, where Trump thinks it should be abolished, but he also thinks, that it should play a role in cutting off funding, but it also should be forked over to states. So Linda McMahon certainly in an interesting position, and as you said, someone who doesn't exactly have a lot of experience handling this kind of federal bureaucracy.
And a huge shift in the philosophies that we saw during the Bush administration. No child left behind. A lot of control here in Washington. Be interesting to see how they handle it. Brett Samuels, we'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Drew.
A $10 billion lawsuit filed by Mexico against top U.S. gun makers is now in front of the Supreme Court. The justices began hearing arguments today in the case that looks to challenge protections U.S. firearm manufacturers have from lawsuits. Mexico has accused the companies of fueling cartel violence with their business practices. And today, a federal judge ruled against the Trump administration's firing of a federal employee. Joining me now is the Hill's Courts and legal reporter, Zach Schonfeld. Zach, what is at the heart of this lawsuit?
Hey, Drew, this lawsuit at the Supreme Court may deal a lot with guns, but it does not implicate the Second Amendment. Instead, this case revolves around a 2005 law that's called PLACA. And for 2 decades, this law has provided broad civil immunity to firearms manufacturers against civil lawsuits over when their firearms end up at crime scenes. So now Mexico is claiming that its lawsuit against American firearm manufacturers is covered by an exception under that law and can move forward. They point to an exception in the law that provides that if a manufacturer knowingly violates American firearms laws, then someone can sue them if they are proximately harmed by that violation. So Mexico claims that the American firearms industry has not done enough to stop their guns from going across the border and ending up in the hands of Mexican cartels. So this case really delves into what is the scope of this exception and whether this $10 billion lawsuit can move forward.
And Zach, conservative justices have a 6-3 majority and in recent years have worked to expand gun rights. Today, one of the liberal justices, Ketanji Brown Jackson, had this to say.
I'm just wondering whether the PLCA statute itself is telling us that we don't want the courts to be the ones to be crafting remedies that amount to regulation on this industry. That was really the point of the entire thing. And so to the extent that we're now reading an exception to allow the very thing that the statute seems to preclude, I'm concerned about that.
Did we get a sense of how the justices are leaning?
We did. It does. You heard it right there in the soundbite from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. The court seems to be coming out of these arguments leaning towards the gun industry. You saw Mexico not only taking hard questions from the 6 conservatives, but also there, as you saw in the soundbite, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is President Biden's sole appointee to the court. We saw several justices today at the arguments really pressing, saying that they believe that this law is designed to present lawsuits exactly like the one at hand that is being brought by Mexico. Of course, we don't have a decision yet. A decision is expected by early summer, likely by the end of June, so we'll have to wait until then for a final ruling. But certainly coming out of these arguments, which is the moment where we get a glimpse into the justices' thinking, they seem to be gravitating towards the gun industry.
And U.S. gun manufacturers are shielded from most civil lawsuits related to crimes committed using firearms, but this case could touch on similar legal issues brought by victims of the 2012 mass shooting at Sandy Hook. The Supreme Court declined to hear that case after it was settled for $73 million. Depending on how the justices rule here, could it narrow or even close the legal path for victims to sue gun companies in the future?
It really could. I mean, you mentioned the Sandy Hook case there. This case that's being brought by Mexico has already gotten further along than that one. As you mentioned, when that case, the Sandy Hook one, came to the Supreme Court, the justices declined to hear it. They didn't even take it up. So the fact that even before we had these arguments today, the fact that the justices had agreed to hear this case brought by Mexico shows an increased eagerness to get involved in this statute and really spelling out the scope of it as well as the scope of any exceptions. This is now the most major case that we've seen at the Supreme Court over this law since it was passed 2 decades ago, back in 2005. And it's why I think you see not only just the parties in this case getting involved, but there's also been a lot of outside attention. We've seen amicus briefs filed on both sides by gun control groups, gun rights groups, even members of Congress. Speaker Mike Johnson and Republican leadership in the House had filed a brief backing the gun industry. So a lot of attention on this case, not only for what it means for this lawsuit brought by Mexico, but also for future lawsuits down the road.
And today, a federal judge ruled in favor of an employee that sits on the 3-person Merit Systems Protection Board, reinstating the employee to her post, saying the termination was unlawful. Is this just a one-off ruling, or does it have implications for other workers' rights cases?
It's in a bit of a different bucket than some of the other cases for just your everyday federal workers who are not, top officials leading these various boards and agencies. This is instead in the bucket of cases that are really challenging Trump's ability to fire these independent agency leaders across the federal bureaucracy. This MSPB and some of these other boards, in federal law, there are removal protections that prevent the president from removing these officials without cause. And what we've seen in these cases is the Trump administration doesn't argue that they have cause. Instead, they've been arguing in court that they believe that these removal protections are unconstitutional. So this is really just the latest case that could set up a very big question about presidential power and the ability for the Trump administration over the next 4 years to take control of some of these independent agencies.
All right, that's all I got for you. Great insight. Zach Schonfeld, thanks so much.
Thanks, Drew.
The recent outbreak of measles in West Texas has now spread to at least 9 states, according to the CDC. Of the more than 160 reported cases, a whopping 146 cases were reported in West Texas, and another 9 were reported across the state line in neighboring New Mexico. The CDC reports 95% of the reported cases occurred in people who were unvaccinated or who had an unknown vaccination status. 82% of cases occurred in children and teens ages 19 and under. 20% of the reported cases have required hospitalization, and 1 school-aged child has died. Measles is especially contagious, with every infected person spreading it to an average of 15 others. Experts say while the virus itself is not usually deadly, it can have serious complications like pneumonia and swelling of the brain. Experts say the best way to avoid measles is to receive the MMR vaccine. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.